Welcome to part 3 of an introduction to the Cycles node editor. In this video, we'll be talking about normal maps and how to use them in the Cycles node editor. Additionally, we'll talk about some nodes that are really important for a PBR workflow and for a procedural texturing workflow. Then, at the end of the video, we'll create our own PBR shader with the knowledge that we learned over the past 3 videos. Now, before we get too far into that, in the last video, I challenged you guys to create your own procedural moon using procedural textures in the Cycles node editor. I'm going to show you what I did, and then you can compare your results to mine. So I decided to use 2 moose grave textures, which are some of the more complicated procedural textures in Cycles. My idea here was to have 1 moose grave texture for all the tiny details and 1 moose grave texture for all the big craters. So if we take the color output of our top moose grave texture and plug it into our diffuse shader, we can see that this is the tiny details. I took this and mixed it with the color gray to get a more grayish feel so it didn't have so much black in it, because obviously our moon isn't dark black. And then we also have the bottom node, which is our big details. And I did the same thing with that. I mixed it with gray to get a nice gray color. And then I mixed the two together using a mix RGB node, which we can see here. And this gives a really nice output. And you can see if we slide the factor back and forth, we can see what it looked like at either side. But when it's mixed together, it looks really nice and it looks relatively similar to a moon. Now, there are countless different ways to do this, so if you did it a completely different way, that's absolutely fine. As long as it somewhat resembles a moon, good job, you completed the challenge. Now, let's get into the good stuff. We'll start off by talking about normal maps. So what are normal maps? Well, long story short, it's this colorful square sitting in the center of your screen right now. This specific normal map is meant to represent diamond plate sheet metal. But the more important question is, what does a normal map do? What does this normal map do? We'll start by talking about a single plane, a flat plane. A flat plane is a two-dimensional object, so by that logic, it only has one face. So I'm going to highlight this in red. It's one face. So let's say I wanted to add a little bit of pizzazz to this plane, so we'll add a bunch of ridges in it. Well, now it has more faces. Let's go ahead and count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 faces. So this geometry has 12 faces instead of 1. Now, what do we know about faces and render time? Well, we know that the number of faces is directly proportional to the amount of time it takes to render something. Meaning that if we have more faces in our scene, it's going to take much longer to render. So that'll be more render time. Now, at a basic level with a plane like this, really the difference in render time is negligible. You will not notice it on any sort of machine. But as your model does gain more and more faces, render time will slow down, and this is especially evident in complex models. In 1996, Venkat Krishnamurthy and Mark Lavoie introduced a new idea to eliminate this problem. Their idea was to create the illusion of displaced geometry, even though there was no actual displaced geometry. This idea would later evolve into the normal map. And that's what a normal map is, an illusion. It takes what would traditionally just be one face of geometry and makes it look like it has some sort of geometric distortion to it. And by doing so, we achieve the same render time as our one-faced object while keeping the detail of our 12-faced object. Seems like a win-win to me. So let's go ahead and jump into Blender and actually use our normal map. So the setup for this is relatively simple. I've got a glossy shader and a material output node and a big frame, which we really don't need the frame. It's just for organization. And then over here on the right, we have a sphere with this glossy material applied to it. And that's sitting on top of a plane with some basic environment lighting. And you can see we can change the roughness as well, so I'm going to set this to about 0.1 just because it provides a nice reflection. So you can see on our glossy shader, we have this normal input, and this is how we're going to use a normal map with our shader. And most shaders will have a normal input. So in order to do this, we'll need an image texture node because we need to bring our normal map, which is an image texture, into our node editor. So we'll click open and navigate to wherever it's saved. Mine is just called diamondplate.jpg, and you can download this from the link in the description if you want to follow along with this exact example. So up at the top of our image texture node, we have this option called color, and this is to change the color space of the output of our node. What we'll be doing here in a second is changing the color space from color to non-color data, because normal maps, although they are technically color maps, aren't using the actual color. What they need is the vector data that's condensed into the color channels. So we'll click this and select non-color data from the list to change this parameter. Anytime you use a normal map, you should do this, otherwise you might get some weird results. Now you might think here, oh hey, let's take this color output and now plug it into our normal input, that way our normal map will appear. And unfortunately that's just not how it works, because we're plugging a color output into a vector input. It just doesn't work. Instead, what we'll need is a normal map node. You can get this by pressing Shift A, going down to the vectors category and selecting normal map. We'll place this in our node editor here. Then we'll take the color output of our image texture and plug it into the color input of our normal map, and take the normal output and plug it into our normal input for our glossy shader. And you can see nothing happens. And that's because our image texture node doesn't have a texture coordinate, right? It doesn't have that vector input. So let's go ahead and add that. We'll press Shift A, go to the input category, and then select texture coordinate. I'm going to drop this into our frame, and I'm going to connect the generated output into the vector input, and voila, we can now see our normal map. Now you can see as the texture approaches the edges, it kind of distorts, and that's because we're using a flat projection map on a 3D sphere. But for the case of demonstration purposes, it doesn't really matter much. In a professional scenario though, you'd want to actually UV unwrap your sphere and map the textures that way. Now in our actual normal map mode, we have this option called strength, in which we can change the strength of the normal map. So you can see if I set it to 0.1 or 0.5, it's less. And if I set it to something like 10, it goes insane depth mode. But for the most part, 1 is usually okay with normal maps. Up on top of our node, we have this option that allows us to choose what type of normal map we're using. 99.9% of the time you'll use tangent space, and maybe once or twice you'll use an object space normal map. You can tell the different types of normal maps apart by looking at their color. So if you go ahead and Google tangent space normal map and then you Google object space normal map, you'll be able to see some strong color differences. But again, you shouldn't really have to worry too much about this, because almost everything nowadays uses a tangent space normal map. Now I've got this texture successfully mapped onto my sphere, but it's still missing something. What if I wanted this texture to be smaller or bigger? That's why the mapping node exists. We can add the mapping node by pressing Shift A, going down to our vector category and selecting the mapping node. We get this big node, and what we're going to do is we're going to drop this between our texture coordinate node and our image texture node. This node will allow us to change things like the scale, location, and rotation of our texture map on our sphere. So let's say I wanted to change the scale of our texture on our sphere. We have 3 options here, X, Y, and Z, and each one of these controls the scale across a certain 3D axis. If we make the scale bigger, the texture gets smaller, which seems backwards, but you can think of it as the amount of times the texture has to repeat across the surface of our geometry. I'm going to set my scale value to 5 because I think that looks good overall. Additionally, we can change the rotation across these same 3 axes, and you can see if I scrub through it here, you can see it very slowly rotating the texture around. I know it's a little bit hard to see because it has to get all pixelated and stuff, but you can change it across any axis. We can also change the location in this same way, and you can see that it does indeed translate the texture slowly but surely across the surface of our 3D geometry. Anyway, I'm going to set this location value back to 0 because I don't want any translations. So there you have it. That is how normal maps work in cycles and, well, pretty much any other 3D application. And also a little bonus with the mapping node. Alright, now let's go ahead and look at something that I think is really awesome and really helpful. I reset the scene to the default because we're going to be working from just this setup. So if you want to delete everything except for your material output node and then add a diffuse node, or if you just want to make a new material, that's fine, as long as you just end up with a diffuse and a material output node. What we're going to be doing here is adding a Fresnel node. What a Fresnel node does is it allows us to use the Fresnel effect in our node editor. So let's talk really quick about the Fresnel effect. And keep in mind, it is pronounced Fresnel, like Fresnel, not Fresnel like it's spelled. So the Fresnel effect is based off of the Fresnel equations, which were derived way back in the day by Augustin Jean Fresnel. The purpose of these equations is to describe how light reacts when moving between 2 different media that have different refractive indices. It specifically focuses on polarized light, S-polarized light and P-polarized light. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the physics of this because it's really not important to this video, but the 2 equations you see sitting in front of you are the Fresnel equations, and they basically just calculate the reflectivity of both different types of polarized light. So what exactly does the Fresnel effect do? And how can we use it to improve the quality and realism of our materials? Let's take a look at that. The relationship described in the Fresnel equations basically states that at grazing angles or smaller angles of incidence, reflectance increases. So I'm actually going to set up two different simulated scenarios here. Each scenario has a light source, a ground plane, a receiver, which is the thing that looks like an eyeball, and then the actual light bounce. The angle between the light bounce and the ground plane is our angle of incidence, or theta I. So the Fresnel effect tells us that at a greater angle of incidence, the material will be less reflective. So if we apply this knowledge to our diagrams, we can figure out that theta I on the left is much greater than theta I on the right. So we can say that our situation on the left is going to be less reflective, and our situation on the right is going to be more reflective. So how can we apply this in cycles? Well, we have to make our angle more reflective when we look at it from a steeper angle. That is why the developers included the Fresnel node, which allows us to do exactly this with ease. So let's go ahead and hop back into Blender. Let's add the Fresnel node. To do this, we'll press Shift A, go to our input category and select Fresnel. We'll drop it to the left of our diffuse node and plug the factor output of the Fresnel node into the color input of our diffuse node. You can see that our sphere now becomes dark in the center and white around the outside. These values represent the reflectivity of our model, because around the edge of the sphere, we're looking at it from a steeper angle, so it's more reflective. But when we're looking at the center of the sphere, it becomes less reflective because our angle of incidence is much greater. You'll also notice that our Fresnel node has an input on it called IOR. IOR is the index of refraction. Every physical substance known to man has an index of refraction of some degree. And basically what index of refraction decides is whether light gets reflected or refracted. If you have a high index of refraction, more light will be reflected. If you have a low index of refraction, more light will be absorbed. We can see this by raising the IOR value. As we raise it, it becomes whiter and whiter because it's reflecting more and more light. As we lower the IOR, the material becomes darker and darker because more light is being refracted instead of reflected. Now, I'm going to reset the IOR value to 1.45 because that's a good median number for index of refraction, but we will be using this node later when we start to work on our PBR shader. But before then, there is one more node that I want to go over. This node is the color ramp node. It's super useful for working with black and white and color data. To get it, press Shift A, go down to the converter category, and select color ramp. It gives us this big node. I'm going to move over my Fresnel node and drop the color ramp node between the Fresnel and the diffuse node. Upon investigating this node, we can see that we have two little handles here, black and white. If we drag the white handle to the left, so it's closer to the black, you'll notice that our sphere becomes progressively more white. And if we drag the black handle to the right, it becomes progressively more black until the white is just barely showing around the rim. We can do this with things like noise textures as well. So I'm going to reset my color ramp here. I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to go to our textures category and select noise texture. I'm going to plug the factor output of our noise texture node into the factor input of our color ramp node. And if I adjust these two handles on our gradient here, I can get a completely different result than what was previously there. We went from something that looked like clouds to something that now looks kind of like the spots on a cow. We can also drag the white handle to the left of our black handle to invert the colors of our node, which does more or less the same thing as the invert node, but now we have a little extra control. Additionally, if we press this little plus button, we can add another handle. And even better, we can assign a color to it. It doesn't have to be black or white either, it can be something like red. And now if we drag all the handles together, we get this really abstract gradient, which is really cool. We can actually replicate this effect with any sort of factor input. So if I were to take the output of my Fresnel node and put it into the input of my color ramp and tweak my handles a bit here, you can see that we can get, if we tweak it a little bit more, there we go, this really cool kind of fade, this gradient from white to black with red in the middle on our sphere, and it looks really interesting. We can also add other colors if we want to get creative, so we'll add some green, make it a little bit Christmassy, even though, you know, Christmas is still a month away from when I'm recording this video. But you can see we can get these really cool effects going with very minimal effort. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the color ramp node. But now let's look at something really special. Let's create our own PBR shader for physically based rendering. If you don't know what physically based rendering is, it basically copies the real life properties of real world objects and allows us to render things with extreme accuracy, extreme photorealism. Now, I could go on and on about the physics behind physically based rendering, however, I'm going to spare you that time and we're just going to jump right into the creation of the shader. So I took that scene I had before and reset it to its default. In fact, I deleted the material. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new material for our sphere, and I'm actually going to name it Pbr Shader. So there are actually a few different types of Pbr shaders that you can create. In this case, we're going to create what's called a Dielectric Pbr Shader, which is the most diverse of all the different types. Dielectric Pbr shaders can create just about any material that you want them to, with the exception of things that are metallic, organic, or transparent. Some basic dielectric materials in the real world include things like rocks, ground textures, or even plastics. So let's actually make this thing. Now, we are going to keep the diffuse BSDF shader that we have right now, and we're also going to add a glossy shader. I'm going to put that right below our diffuse BSDF shader and do my best to align it here. There we go. And I'm going to actually add a mix shader because we're going to mix these two together. So I'll press Shift A and add a mix shader. We'll plug the diffuse shader into the top shader input and the glossy into the bottom, and then the output into our material output node. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to add a Fresnel node to cover the factor input of our mix shader. Now remember, the Fresnel effect states that at grazing angles, things are more reflective, which is why we're mixing the glossy shader over a diffuse shader using the Fresnel node. This allows us to replicate the Fresnel effect with CGI. Now what we're going to do with these nodes is move them into a group. We're going to create basically our own custom node. To do this, we'll select all three nodes by holding Shift and clicking each one after the other, and then we'll press Ctrl G. And holy cow, all of a sudden our node editor is green, and that's because we're actually inside of the node group. To leave, we'll select this input node on the left and press Tab. And we can see this custom node or node group that we've created here. Node groups are another great way to organize nodes. So let's take a look on the inside again. We'll press Tab to enter the node group. Inside of our node group, we have this input node. And what this input node allows us to do is to create the inputs for our custom nodes. So things like these. So you'll see our node has none. So if we go back into it and we hook our little outlined output into one of the inputs of our node, that will reroute the input of that node to the outside of our node group. So now we can change it here. Let's go ahead and hook up some of our other inputs. I'll start by hooking up the roughness input to both our diffuse node and also our glossy node. And then I'll also hook up the normal inputs to all three of these different nodes. Last, I'll hook up the IOR input from the Fresnel node into our input node. Now, one thing you might be curious about is why we didn't hook anything up to the color input of our glossy shader. And that's because by nature, dielectric materials, right, which is this type of Pbr shader we're creating right now, do not have colored reflections. So we'll actually leave this as white. I'm not going to go too far into depth as to why that happens because again, it's not really the point of this tutorial. Just leave it white and leave it unhooked up to anything. Now, there is one thing that I'm not liking about this shader, and it's that our IOR input is below our normal input, because in every other shader, the normal is at the bottom. We can change this by pressing N with our input node selected, and we get this little list up here in the upper right with all the different inputs that we have. What we can actually do is we can select one of these and click the arrows in the upper right corner of our node editor window to move it up or down. So I move the IOR above the normal map, and this looks good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and actually tab out, and you can see here is our finished node. And last but not least, we're going to go ahead and actually change the name of our node to Dielectric so we can keep it nice and organized. So Dielectric. And perfect, we now have our finished Dielectric Pbr shader. Perfect, so let's go and actually test out our Dielectric Pbr shader. I'm going to open up Chrome and get a set of PBR textures from cgbookcase.com. cgbookcase is really awesome. They have a bunch of different textures that are completely free to use and you don't even have to credit them. So I'd strongly recommend if you're first getting started with this using this, and then maybe later on using something like Polygon. I'm going to find a texture that I like. There's a lot of rocks here, which are good because we have a dielectric shader. I'm going to use this texture called Rock 2. Now you can see it has a bunch of different maps here: color, roughness, normal, height, and ambient occlusion. And it does say PBR ready here, so we're gonna go ahead and click download. And you can type in your email and download that way, but I'm just gonna click direct download. That way it downloads straight through our browser. Most of the files on this site are around 64 megabytes, so they might take a little bit to download, especially because the server speed isn't ridiculously fast. But when it does finish, you can go ahead and open up the zip file, and you can see we have 5 different textures in here, right? The same ones that were described before. All we really need, I'm actually gonna go to my desktop here, are the base color, normal, and roughness maps. So I'll select these and drag them out of our zip file, or unzip them, whatever you prefer to do. And now you can see we have our 3 image textures over here. So if I go ahead and open one of these up, open up on my other monitor, but you can see here's our color, normal, and then roughness map. And we'll be using these with our PBR shader. So let's go ahead and open up Blender again. We'll press Shift A and add an image texture node because we need to bring image textures in, right? So we'll select open, and I'll go to my desktop because that's where they're saved, and I'll import my base color image. We'll hook up the base color image to the color input and change the projection mode to box because we want a 3D representation. We'll add another image texture node. This time we'll use the roughness map, and we'll change the projection mode to box, and we'll also change the color space to non-color data. This is another one of the things that you should use non-color data for. And then we'll need to add one more image texture here for our normal map, so we'll open that up. Then we'll change the projection mode to box and the color space to non-color data. And then we'll add our normal map mode so we can use it as a normal map. We'll hook up the colors and the normals, and we can see that it's now kind of working to an extent. I'm going to really quick just organize my nodes here just so they make a little bit more sense and are less curvy. And you'll notice we left the IOR input as it is. Let's just leave it at 1.45 because that's a good approximate number for everything. And IOR really doesn't affect how materials look that much. All right, and the last thing we need to do to get our textures to appear properly is to add a texture coordinate node and hook up the generated input to all 3 of our image textures. And upon doing so, congratulations, you've just made your first PBR material. It looks really cool, especially if you get really nice environment lighting on it. PBR materials are super useful, especially if you want to create really photorealistic renders. If you'd like to know more about this stuff, I'd strongly recommend checking out Andrew Price's tutorial on photorealism. There is a card in the upper right corner of the screen right now. Click that, it'll take you there and you can watch that. It's so cool and it's super insightful and it should improve your renders. I know it improved mine a lot. Now with that being said and our PBR shader being made, that about sums it up for this video. I know we did go over a lot in this video, so if for whatever reason you have a question, feel free to leave a comment down below. I read every single comment, or you can email me. My email is down in the description and I'll be more than happy to help you out with whatever you're having trouble with. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Adios!